Okay, let's get started. Hope everybody's enjoying the weather because in a couple weeks it'll be spring. So welcome to class. We've got a couple new faces in the audience. Welcome. On Tuesday we saw a couple movies, Stumped and Fixed. Everybody enjoyed the movies. Everybody was there. And Molly made a cameo appearance in there. I hope you caught her. Does anybody have any questions or observations or thoughts about what you saw? There was a lot going on there. So does anybody have any thoughts? My thought was that there's just an extreme variety of perceptions of people with disabilities. You know, we had folks like Hugh Hare, who has had lower limb prosthetics, and he was overjoyed that he had those prosthetics that wouldn't go back to having regular legs. So that was one extreme. And then there's folks like Gregor, who got along just fine in a lever drive wheelchair and in a car and stuff, and he said he was perfectly satisfied the way that he was and with his life. And then there's people like Fernanda, who just likes to try everything that might help her live a little bit better. So just a real diversity of opinions, including using the term variation, that people with disabilities are a variation on the human condition, which I've never heard before. So anybody else have any thoughts about what they saw? If you know of people that are interested in viewing it, I have the DVD on loan, overnight loan, if you want to share it with friends and stuff. So let me know about that. Okay. So we've got the standard forms, but we got a new form here, and this would be particularly interesting to you because it's the sign-up sheet for food for next Thursday. So if you next Thursday are the project demonstrations, which will be held outside here by the Grove. Everybody is welcome to attend, and if you want to attend and have a slice of pizza or a piece of a burrito, please sign up. That includes community members as well. It ought to be a lot of fun, and it'll be a great way to end the quarter. So please plan on attending that. And okay, so that's March 12th. So the story is we'll meet in the classroom first. We'll fill out an evaluation form, and when you're done with that, everybody bring their projects. We'll go outside. I'll have some tables, and hopefully, it won't rain. If it does rain, we'll set up in the breezeway out here. It'll be a chance for everybody to see everybody else's project. So make sure you spend time explaining your project, but also time checking out what the other students have done. It's really important that you do that. So no posters, no handouts. It's going to be a very low-key, informal, fun time. So and invite people that you've worked with to come to this event to check out what you've done, and be sure to thank them as well for their participation. Okay. So for your project, it's like crunch time now. So as I said, I'm looking for something that's functional, but I'm not looking for something that's ready to be marketed, and I tell folks that too. So do what you can to make it functional and working. Worry about aesthetics and beauty for your future plan. So if you're still working on your project and it's not quite done, you should have contingency plans in case something that you thought would work wouldn't work. So keep on thinking about how you would make the best kind of presentation. Be really good to add a Stanford logo on it, or if your team has a logo, please add that. And really important point for both your presentation next week and in talking about your project and writing about your project and report is you never should apologize for what you've done or the way you did it or what was missing, because that really looks bad. And you can mention that it's in your future plans, okay? So do that. Because, everything is a prototype, so nothing is completely finished ever, so keep that in mind. Next Tuesday are the project presentations, and the order is the inverse of what we had for the midterm. So Eric goes first this time. All right. So we'll have a short break in the middle, and the considerations for the presentations is email me your PowerPoints like you did for the midterm by noon on Tuesday. I'll load them all into my computer so we can have a quick turnaround from one project presentation to the other. And the important thing for me is that we do a professional job, and that includes dressing professionally. So you're practicing being a professional. You're not a student for that presentation. You're a professional. So I don't mean like a suit and jacket, but just something nice. A nice, t-shirts are out, blue jeans are out, sandals are out. Okay, just nice dressed. No demos during the presentation. You're going to do your demos on Thursday following, so save it for that. If somebody's interested, you say, come Thursday, check it out on Thursday. So show your prototype in your slides, because your prototype may be this big, but the slide is huge, so you can see it better if it's on the slide. Okay? And you're still going to get 8 minutes, so you practice that during your midterm. The things I want you to focus on are, what you did between the midterm and now, and your results. But you still have to tell the whole story about the whole. Start from the beginning. You've got to have a complete story, because there might be people here that don't know about your project. So make it a complete story. Have it clear and concise. Practice it as before. Practice how you switch from one person to another, where you're going to stand. This all adds a lot. And things like, crossing your arms and putting your feet in your pocket and stuff like that. That's not professional. So it's, for 8 minutes, you can be a professional presenter for 8 minutes. I hope that's within your grasp. Because, once you leave here, you're going to be a professional all the time. So get 8 minutes of practice. This thing. So it'd be good to have not more than one video of your device in use, hopefully by a user. So make a short video, put it on YouTube, put a link on your slides, and when it gets to that point, I'll manage the computer to show your video. And we're going to go with no questions. If somebody has a question, they can come on Thursday and ask all of the questions they want. So on Thursday, it's all open. We're not going to go from one team to another and have them explain it. It's all just free for all. It's like a science fair. So any questions on any of that? Okay. So today, we're very pleased to have. Oh, Ralph, did
you go around and come in at the top?
Okay, yeah, and we'll have the spotlight on you. Okay. Well, we're going to take a break anyway. Ralph Hotchkiss. We're going to take a break, and then I'm going to introduce them. So students who haven't signed the attendance sheet or the food sign-up, please do that now. Take a cookie and prepare for Ralph's presentation. Can what?
Can you lower these seats?
No. Sorry. Yeah.
You have a height limit for your...
I'm sorry.
You have a lower height limit when you take the class.
Oh.
Stupid seats.
Yeah, I'm sorry about that, but I didn't. It's one of the limitations of the classroom. You can't move these tables around, and they're fixed. And although they did refurbish the room a couple years ago. This is what we get. Sorry. I'll have this here on Tuesday as well. Yeah. Yeah.
I forgot to respond to you as well.
Yeah.
But like, so like you're available.
Yeah.
Can we schedule like this?
Okay, send me an email. Regarding that. Ralph, are you ready?
Yes.
Okay. Well, you're in for a real treat today. Ralph Hotchkiss is an engineer, consummate engineer and inventor and designer of the Whirlwind wheelchair. And the organization Whirlwind Wheelchair International is a nonprofit located in Berkeley. Its mission is to make it possible for every person in the developing world who needs a wheelchair to obtain one that will lead to maximum personal independence and integration into society. Ralph, until recently, taught a class at San Francisco State University, and it was a course called Wheelchair Design and Construction, in which students actually built a complete wheelchair from scratch that was appropriate for use in a third world country. So Ralph is a graduate of Oberlin College and one of the first MacArthur Foundation Genius Award fellows, and this is really important, he was the first AutoCAD user ever back in the DOS days. So 1982. So he was way ahead of his time. So let's welcome Ralph Hotchkiss.
So I work with scores of people. Oh, you want to?
Yeah.
Yeah, for recording.
Go ahead.
Okay. It's been in over 40 developing countries, primarily in order to steal their good ideas, because not enough was happening in the wealthy world. Most people in the States who ride wheelchairs, yes, they're looking at what's the best they can get, what are the new developments and so forth, and trying to figure out how to pay for them. But how many people does anybody here know who have built their own chairs? I was lucky enough to start riding a chair back in the middle 1960s when chairs were so bad that I had no choice but to build my own. I mean, my first chair, $2,000, more than $2,000 in today's money, lasted half a block, and the manufacturer said, it's beyond repair, but we'll give you another one under warranty for free, just like it. And of course, well, between the two of them, I could hardly keep them running by switching parts back and forth. They were so poorly designed. And so I started building my own chairs right away. It was kind of easy for me because I had already built my own bicycles, including a 6-seater for riding around Oberlin College. And so, but there were big limitations in wheelchairs. One of them was that every year I would fall out 2, 3, 4 times, usually at night, in the rain, in the snow, when I couldn't see very well. Bang, I'd hit against a crack in the sidewalk or a small curb, and I would just fall over forward. Well, a wheelchair has about a 15, 16-inch track length and a 26-inch high center of gravity. If you build a Toyota that way, it's 3 stories tall. And you imagine, hit a crack in the sidewalk with it, it'll tip over just like a wheelchair, and they do, I suppose. I mean, theoretically. And so I kept falling over, and had some injuries along the way, as almost everybody does. And yes, I could improve my chair. I made it 2 inches narrower without changing the size of the seat and a few other important changes. But there were other things like the tippiness of it forward, like the frequent breakdowns that I was only slowly making progress on. So I looked all over the U.S. and all over Europe for other people who were working on chairs and making great progress, and I didn't find much. A little bit in the sports area, but for everyday use, very little was happening. There was a monopoly pretty much worldwide from 1950 to 1980, and I was right in the middle of that, so that was definitely holding back progress. But when I visited Nicaragua in 1979, I met some people who had already taken old chairs from the north, donations, broken them in a very short time, reinforced them, remodeled them, re-engineered them, and they knew more than the U.S. industry put together about how to make a chair to last. One of them was just a teenager, 16 years old, but one of the best and the brightest. He convinced me to start working with some people in Managua. They set up Nicaragua's first independent living center, and we started building chairs together. We worked together for the next few years, making some progress. He unfortunately nearly died twice because of the U.S. blockade on antibiotics against Nicaragua. As a paraplegic, spinal cord injury, he needed antibiotics once in a while, especially in a tropical climate like Nicaragua. And he eventually, with help from some of us here in Bay Area, came to the U.S. After years of studying English at Laney College, got into Berkeley, became a mechanical engineer. Now he works at NASA Ames. He's been using Nicaraguan wheelchair seat technology to make the core of the science they use for the cabins within the spacecraft, so that you can weigh different amounts and you won't get pressure sores. So those are the first people I met, great people to work with. We eventually found others in other countries who were doing the same thing, building their own chairs. Philippines, 1981. Mexico, 1981. Other countries eventually all around the world. And we started getting together. We formed what we called the Whirlwind Network. And we'd get together whenever we could and trade ideas and correspond a little bit. Then it was with pen and paper and mail. And so one of the big problems that they were all having was tipping over forwards. And if you look at Nick Zerpolo's chair, thank you, Nick. Notice how long his chair is compared to his wheelbase. Now, Nick has wisely bought just about as long a wheelbase chair as he can get, but his footrests are still way out ahead of the front wheels, even though he has small front wheels. That, again, is to make it not quite so long. His footrests are out of the front wheels because they take all that space to swivel. The chair that we eventually came up with the help of what's called the Zimbabwe wheel, a development in Zimbabwe, doesn't tip forward. I've ridden it, again, 2 or 3 times a year. I would always fall. And in the 15 years that I've been riding this longer wheelbase but shorter overall length chair, in which my footrests aren't ahead of the front wheels, I have not fallen forward once. Not once. Now, it's a combination of the track length and the seat angle and all of the above. I'm a T2, T4 para, high-level para. So if I sit in an erect chair, I fall forward a lot. So I needed a whole combination of things, including track length, including seat angle, and a few other twists to make it all work together. Take a look at my chair. The front wheels are under the footrests, under my toes. The footrests have an angle like yours do, and that means my toes are higher than my heels. That gives me some extra space to work with. A wheel this tiny, this is only a little over 100, this is 110 millimeters in diameter, a little over 4 inches. A wheel that small is generally not very safe in a wheelchair. Yours are 150, and yours are on the small side, as you know, on the hazardous side. But these work because, one, they're very flexible. Those of you who can see, the rubber is very thin. There's no rubber in the sides. They're only a centimeter thick, these at the middle, inside of the hourglass shape of the rubber. And because they're so flexible, harder in the center, softer on the edges, they don't tend to fall into cracks so much. They tend to float over, as well as a very wide pneumatic tire might, but at a very tiny fraction of the cost of a pneumatic, and a much higher dependability than a pneumatic ever had. And all that together makes them far safer than a typical 4-inch tire. This wheel was invented in Zimbabwe about 30 years ago for push carts in a big 14-inch, 350 millimeter size. And we copied it first in 8 inches, then 7 inches, then 6 inches. Then we went all the way down to 100 millimeters. Now we've come back up to 110. Again, zeroing in on what seems like the best compromise in size and weight and knee height. The goal is to make a chair that won't raise my knee height any higher than a standard chair. Knees are already too high. You're too tall, too. That makes it all the much harder. The taller you are, the harder it is to work with a wheelchair in a regular, inaccessible environment. Have to raise all the tables a lot more. And or sit side saddle when you're eating out. All those things are very frequent accommodations that we make to the inaccessible environment. So this chair is 24 plus 14, 36 inches long about. No, 38 inches long. And a standard chair with toes, and counting the toes, is about 48 inches. How long is yours? Yours would be? About 48. 48. Okay. My guess is yours is 48 without your toes. I think you're 52, because you bought a long enough chair not to fall over all the time. And so we've cut the average length by about 250 millimeters, 10 inches. Yet we've increased the track length from about 15, 16 inches to 20 inches, 400 millimeters track length. Kind of like free lunch as far as making a stable vehicle. Now this one has just enough length that there's not enough energy to lift me up and over that front pivot. If I run into something, if I run into something hard enough, I can get the rear wheels to go up a little, but there's not enough energy to lift me up and over. And so, as an amazing result to me, in 15 years I haven't fallen, not even once. And I've had broken legs and other issues. I remember when I fall, in the years before. Yes?
It's this button here, and the green line is the laser pointer.
Thank you. So, here's one of the first people in Nicaragua who built chairs, working with Omar Talavera, the fellow at NASA Ames, and 2 others of us. And this is a recent picture. You can tell by the color of my hair. I won't tell you how recent. It's been a while. And here we're going down the street in front of her house in Nicaragua. It's This one's even more or less been paved, but pavement doesn't last forever and maintenance is expensive. So the going is rough all over the place, all over most of the world. You run into rough spots like this every day, in most of the world. As many of you know from first-hand experience, I'm sure. Here's Kenya. The fellow leading the three of us was a 15-year-old who had broken his back falling off a roof at age 8, and spinal cord injury just like mine. Amazingly, he survived. Most people don't in most of the world. Life expectancy under 2 years in most of the world for a complete spinal cord injury. If you have enough to maintain more sensation, your likelihood of survival goes up quickly. But for those of us who weren't that lucky, we don't last long. But through a really, really careful and hard driving mother, he got the medical assistance he needed to stay alive. And they balance things, they prevent his bladder infections, all the other. Pressure sores are the biggest issue. He had 7 when I met him. And one of them 7 inches long. Last I heard, he didn't have any. Part of that is good seating. But here he is going back to school. He had been back to school every single year at the beginning of the school year with his mother, and they had fought with the local principals and superintendents every year and not been allowed back in school. Wheelchair riders don't do that. Reminds me of the blind guy who rides a bicycle. Blind people don't do that. Well, that's why they don't do that, because people say they don't do that. And by the way, you know, can anybody tell me his name? I've known about him for years, but just now there's a very good video on YouTube. If you go on YouTube and write down blind see, it explains how blind people do see. Very much like we do, but only...
At the VA Blind Center, Western Blind Rehab Center.
I don't know.
Yeah, because
I'm sure he's had interactions there.
this is the guy that works there, and he has retinitis pigmentosa, but he wants to ride his bike.
Okay, well, this is the guy who's been riding his bike every day since 20 years ago. So this is the role model. Anyway, look that up on YouTube. Very nice. Turned me around. Educated me a lot. And I worked strictly with blind people in the early 60s as my high school science project. Came up eventually with a clicker that you mount on the tip of your standard cane. And that helps you hear curbs, helps you hear things around you. Well, this guy's been doing the same thing as many blind people have whenever he's moving around. Yes, that too. All kinds of ways they get echolocation, bat-wise. And they call him Batman. That's right. Go in, put in Batman blind see. You'll have it right away. So at age 15, he was going back to school, trying to get back into 3rd grade, and for the umpteenth time. But following him is a young woman who is one of the local activists who was just about to give a lecture to the principal about the Kenya Disabilities Act. And she quoted directly from the ADA, the Americans with Disabilities Act, about all the aspects of schooling that he was violating. And he believed her that that law had been passed. Within a year, the kid, who was fully bilingual, English and Swahili, English and a local language, trilingual, and fully literate as far as reading and writing, He was in high school. Within a few weeks, they just kept bumping him up and up. So, and there was no turning back. Here's one of the guys who builds chairs in the Philippines. There's a group called Tahanan Walang Hagdanan. Started in 1976, before I ever discovered Nicaragua. Building chairs to replace the American ones that had been brought in after the Second World War, which were all broken. And they, again, had reverse engineered our chair and made it much, much stronger. And they taught me so much. They taught, eventually, Omar Talavera went there shortly after I did to learn from them as well. And they basically brought us up to speed. And then we started inventing chairs as fast as we could to change the concept of the base of the chairs so that it was safer, so that it worked better and went faster. There he is rocketing along the local road on his Whirlwind. And there's a typical chair. Look at how short, and her front wheel is backwards because she was rolling backwards to get out of her house to come say hello. But her track length normally is about 4 inches shorter than what you see there. Very short and very unstable. That chair is made in a US funded factory, funded in the middle 70s. They've been making that chair, which was patented in 1926. Ever since, they still make it. It's the biggest, the most popular, the most common, not really that popular, but it's common in India. Costs at that time $200. It's up a bit now, a very high price compared to the $50 of an adult bicycle in India. But it's a near monopoly, and it's a government job. And those chairs, mostly broken all the time. I tried to work with them in the 80s, but it was like beating my head against a brick wall. Of their 400 employees, 2 of them were wheelchair riders, and those 2 people could take air. They were very athletic, and they loved our then shorter but not quite so short as this wheelbase chairs. But the management were retired industry and military, and really not that anxious to make change. Yep. So our shop got going in Nicaragua very fast. We had a lot of visitors from other countries, 1 by 1, by 2, by 3, learning how to make what the Nicaraguans were making. Look at the front of his chair. That's a transitional model. We were working on the front wheel. He wanted to test it. He sawed off the other, or maybe it just broke off, and put on that front wheel. But his chair is a locally made, homemade chair. Square tubing, the cheapest, simplest. And by 2000, we had the predecessor of this model. This is 2010, our latest plateau. We tend to have design plateaus every 5 years or so. This is basically the same one I'm riding. Nice long wheelbase, nice stable, folding frame, X-brace under the seat, folding, flip-up footrests, 12-degree seat angle, which is on the erect side for an automobile. And automobiles tip their seats back so that they don't have too many people slamming into the dashboard. Same problem I have with a chair. I don't want to go forward. So it's a compromise between so far back that you're not right up there ready to work. But in my case also, up there right at that angle where if I lean forward further, then there I fall forward. My belt helps a bit too, 7 inches wide. It prevents scoliosis, has for 40 years, and helps me sit up straight. So many issues go into figuring out what the best compromises are in chair design. And we have tried to find compromises that are pretty much universal in all cultures as best we could, because our needs are not that much different around the world. they have more to do with economic level than with which culture we're in, as far as what kind of chair we need. Yeah. So many issues. Got to look at them all. And there's one issue. If you're making chairs far from home, if anybody is exporting chairs, they need to design them differently to fit the maximum number into one container. And that affects a lot of chairs around the world today. That's also part of why chairs like yours can still be made in the US and compete with the imports. Because your chair is a non-folding, it would be hard to ship. Activists, the groups we work with have come up spontaneously from following local need. When I first started working around the world in late 70s, early 80s, I was really surprised by how far along disability rights movement was in so many countries. In 1981, Disabled People International, the first big umbrella group of multiple types of disabilities, held their first world meeting in Singapore. 52 countries were represented, all people who had raised their own funds to somehow get there. And they had done things like these folks, trying to get the basics. Healthcare, schooling, jobs, housing, transportation, just the basics. Kind of obvious, but we didn't have them here either in most cases. I mean, there's been different countries are moving faster than others, but it's amazing how far along groups in so many countries had become as long as 40 years ago. And laws like our Americans with Disability Act, it's obsolete. Uganda proved how far you could go back when Idi Amin was thrown out, and some of the people who threw him out were newly disabled women, disabled by the fight. And they were very active, and they worked with their legislature to write an Americans with Disabilities Act equivalent that required there be a percentage of representation for people with disabilities at every level of government. And not only for disabled men, but separately for disabled women, because these women knew exactly how things work in the real world. And that, surprisingly, because there are so many levels of government, all the way down to the smallest township opened up 50,000 elected positions in the Ugandan government alone. Well, I'm sure there are not anywhere near that many people in the whole world with significant recognized disabilities who are in elected public office. There are a good number of people with significant disabilities working every day in public office, but not 50,000 nor close. But they've actually supposedly filled 20,000 of those spaces by now. And they are people with disabilities or people who the local disabled population has said they will represent us. They are our person. And somehow they get them approved, and then they get them elected. And they do it just the same way they elect a third of their legislature members being women. They just count the votes until they have a third women, even though the Old Boys Network gets most of the votes. There are enough women to fill a third of the legislature easy, and they do. And they have a cabinet level officer who is one of their war heroes, a young woman, not so young anymore, who just fights and speaks. She's one of the best spokespeople for people with disabilities in the whole world, by far. Just great. And South Africa, when it had its revolution, they know where to go for advice. The Ugandans had come to us and said, okay, what's wrong with your ADA? And they heard a lot, but they went further in correcting it than we ever imagined. and South Africa has copied and tweaked it a bit, and they have an excellent Disabilities Act. Nicaragua passed one in about 1982 that guaranteed physical access. Again, pretty early. There was no Americans with Disabilities Act until 1990, though some of us were fighting for it in Washington at the time. But we didn't know how good or bad it would be, or exactly what it would be like if we ever got far enough to make it happen. The Nicaraguans did a very good job for 1982 of writing an Access Act. Enforcement is still dreadfully lacking, but percentage-wise, if you go outside of Illinois, Massachusetts, California, some of the more progressive states, you'll find that the ADA is pretty much unrecognized in much of this country as well today. Even though some of it came from George Wallace, one of our most conservative government officials. So here are people in Novosibirsk, Russia, New Siberia, where a lot of the exiles were sent in various times in history. Town of 1 million people, and they're doing educational things like this, where they will all travel by public transit. Notice the tracks going down on the left side of the stairs. That was their earlier token bit of access. You'd adjust the spacing between those two tracks and roll the chair up and down it. It was almost as hard as pulling it up and down the stairs, and just as scary. But they've gone ahead in recent years and begun to put in more and more lifts and long ramps. Long ramps being the preference of most local people because they never break down. And local writers of BART can tell you all about that. This is a women's group in Uganda. One of our fairly early groups, started in '96. They were connected through the Women's Conference in Beijing in '96, was that? '94, '96? I think '96. And by '98 they were well along, making hundreds of chairs. And they started out a nonprofit. They became a small business run by the woman in the foreground and some of her 6 children, among them 2 great mechanics. We moved out of San Francisco State after 25 years and after teaching 200 women how to weld, and moved to Berkeley, to the industrial slums of Berkeley, and we're happily building a new shop. It's pretty much functional now, in the remains of a 100-year-old foundry, a steel foundry, a cast iron foundry. This is Nicaragua. I just came back from Nicaragua on Monday, and in 6 weeks there I got to meet many of my old friends, the ones who've survived especially. Didn't meet the rest of them, unfortunately. And there's been a good number of people, especially with spinal cord injury, who have died young, especially during the 80s and early 90s when antibiotics were very hard to obtain. But they were full of ideas, and I came back with enough projects to keep me busy for a long time. I'll maybe go back in 6 months and see what progress some of them have made in their experiments and compare them to mine, and see if we can put together some chairs that will be as fast as hand-powered tricycles but still fit where a wheelchair goes. Looking for that perfect compromise. Wheelchairs are very inefficient even in this form, because all of our weight on our front wheels goes down on a side slope, tries to turn downhill. And with this particular set of hand rims, came from a factory that doesn't have plating or good access to plating. And so they paint their hand rims. These are powder coated. Paint lasts longer, and I wish it was gone. One of these days, I'm going to sand it all off. Sand off all the paint, because as I would go down, even on a level road in Nicaragua, my chair was, of course, unless you're really lucky for a moment, you can't go in the middle of the road where it's level. And the roads there are pretty heavily crowned because of it's tropical country. The rains are heavy. And they need to carry the water away to the side and down fast. So they have a lot of slope on the side. Just to go in a straight line, I would have to drag one hand and push only with the other. And my hands would get so hot just on the level. Forget going down hills. I'd have to stop regularly and let the steam rise. And a tricycle doesn't have that problem because you steer and pedal at the same time. This is a front wheel drive, or in India they're a rear wheel drive. You drive with one hand on a hand crank to a bike chain to a rear wheel while you steer with the other hand. Both have their drawbacks, but neither one of them turns downhill, and so both of them are at least twice as efficient as a wheelchair. Go twice as fast, twice as far, or you go with half the energy, your choice. Way better than wheelchairs, but they don't fit in the loo. You can't go to the bathroom in one of those because they tend to be very long. They have a big turning radius compared to a wheelchair. Some don't have a very big turning radius, but well, yeah, they're so long that even if you can turn on a dime, which some of them can, you still take a lot of space. They don't fit in the kitchen, they don't fit in the workshop, and they don't fit on public transit. Or if they do, you end up paying a lot extra. I mean, even now, this chair folds because the Nicaraguans and the Filipino groups and the early Kenya groups all insisted we have to have a folding chair because we pay triple to go visit Grandma on holidays. We pay for a whole row of seats in the minibus because our non-folding chair, like all the chairs built in Uganda going way back, our chair doesn't fit anywhere else except by pushing a bunch of people out, and so we pay triple, even though there might be laws, and there are laws in more and more countries saying that we get equal treatment, but they can't get that one enforced. Even in Nicaragua, one of the leading countries, some of the drivers recognize the law, many don't, and it really all depends whether the van is already half full and they know they can fill it, or if it's clearly going to have a lot of space in it, then they'll accept. And tricycles typically don't fold. There are very few folding tricycles that have ever been on the market anywhere. Europe has a lot of hand-powered tricycles and lever drives, going back as much as 65 years that I know of. One was designed, one of the earlier ones, a lever drive was a good design, designed in California, had automotive steering on the front end, 4 wheels. You'd twist the handle on the push lever that would crank the rear wheel like a locomotive, and twisting the handle would steer both front wheels. Very nice. Rack and pinion inside the push lever. Very nice. Variable gear ratio by moving the handles up and down. But it never went in the States because we were into cars. At least that's what the manufacturer eventually, when they gave up manufacturing, that was what they said. They couldn't sell very many in the States. We also didn't have bike lanes. We didn't have bicycle appropriate traffic laws. And so they gave up here, but eventually it caught on in Europe and went well. Not great, but well. So there are a lot of French, there are a lot of German, there are a lot of Scandinavian, different kinds of crank and lever, and tricycle with single front wheel drive running around. And those have become very popular in India, China, Africa. There are more tricycles in India than there are wheelchairs. But most people with my level of disability don't use them. Very, very few, because how do you get in the bathroom? Generally, people who can hop on the ground and scoot really well, or who can walk a little. Maybe they have a couple of canes stuck in the back. They're the ones who use the tricycles. We would like to find a way to make something as good as a tricycle and as good as a wheelchair at the same time. And one way to do that is with a detachable tricycle front end. We've done that, but they've never been that popular, partly because of the extra cost of buying 1.5 vehicles, basically. So anyway, so we're always looking for something like that, and also looking to lower our costs a lot. Our chairs cost typically $200 to make, $150 in Southeast Asia, $250 in Colombia, a fairly high-priced country, $200 in much of Africa. We'd like to get that down by 25–40%. Somehow, but we don't know how yet. Now, one of the ways we can cut the cost is by getting rid of having to have a custom wheelchair axle. Our axles are 12 millimeters, or in some countries, half-inch diameter, only in America. They have to be much thicker than the 3/8 inch axle on a bicycle, on the rear of a bicycle, in order to be strong enough so that they don't get bent by all the banging around we do. And I mean, just in general, chairs have to be as strong as you can make them, so that I can do whoops, I hope that's not too fragile. I have to do whatever I can to make them stronger than I can ever break. And again, we do lab testing. We destroy them in the lab. We give them to people like Nick, who destroy them. However they do it, we don't know. But if you can break it any way, it's going to break. And so that's just a given. So this fellow is preparing a regular bicycle hub. He's modifying it a bit, but eventually he hopes not to need to modify it. This is a fellow who's worked on chairs for about 5 years, since he was 14 in Nicaragua. And he's going to take an idea from 1965 in Uganda, and it probably predates that considerably, where, like with some of the hand-powered tricycles, they have a fork that goes around the rear wheel so that you can use a regular off-the-shelf bicycle wheel. That cuts the capitalization cost way down of a small shop. You don't need to have a custom hub made somehow, somewhere, in-house or not. You don't need to have a custom axle. You don't even need to know how to spoke your wheels and align them. You just go to the bike shop and you buy a pair of wheels and put it on. And a very still popular 1965 Ugandan design with front wheel drive, big 28-inch wheels, and a big 9-inch wooden rear caster, has forks around it. Works fairly well. The downside of the Ugandan model is that it makes the chair 3 inches wider, and it already doesn't fit in half the outhouses. But now we have 3 degrees camber on all of our chairs. That was invented by women racers, wheelchair racers, in the 70s, where a couple of women in 1974 cambered their rear wheels enough to put the hand rims right in the line with the middle of their shoulder, and all of a sudden, instead of doing what the men would razz them and say was chicken winging, they pushed straight from their shoulder, and they beat most of the men that year. Set a new set of records. The next year the men all did it, and nobody without camber has ever caught up in the races since then. Well, so even on regular chairs, a few degrees of camber is a good idea. If it's just 3 degrees, you can still fit through the same size door. How can that be? Anybody got a thought? You want to fit through the narrowest door you can. You need the width of your seat and the width of a strong wheel with a little bit of space for getting it banged up and having it not rub on your side. You need space for good hand rims. Nick has the best hand rims invented in Menlo Park. A different shape of hand rim that I wish we could replicate in developing countries. It's 1.5 inches high, 40 millimeters high, and 20 millimeters wide. A much better grip. You can grab onto it. I mean, that's why all the railings on all the stairs in this country are typically 1.5 inches. So you can, because that's the perfect size for the average hand to grab strongly. This is a little teeny thing. Our hand rooms are 3 millimeters bigger than standard, than the old hospital chairs, but still like to be much bigger. Of course, a lot of us just grab like that anyway, because we need all the power we can get, and this is a lower gear than this. Anyway, so he's going to put a fork on that wheel that comes around the rear, again, just like the Ugandan chairs. You need to be able to push the hand room over a full stroke without hitting that fork. So they angle it at about a 45-degree angle backward. But because we have 3 degrees of camber, which is the smallest amount, the biggest camber we can have and still fit through the same door. Nobody's figured out how yet. Yes?
It's almost time for class to be over, so what I suggest is that we take some questions now,
Okay.
and people who have to leave at around 5:30 can do so, and people that would like to stay can finish your presentation and come down and take a look at Ralph's chair. So, does anybody have any questions? Alexander?
Yeah.
Would you be willing to provide an email address that I can contact you at? I've got a list
Sure.
of questions.
Yes. Yes. Is it on your?
I think it's on the website, the webpage for the presentation.
I hope so. Yes.
That was question number. So, what about the fifth wheel bags?
We have them. Yes. And we make sure that they allow you to tip back far enough before they hit the ground. This is an anti-tip wheel, wheelie bar. We make them so that they allow you to tip back far enough to climb a sizable curb by scooting and ramming it. And if you look at the back of this chair, can you see it beyond there's a socket right in the back, 2 sockets, and they'll fit 1 or 2 anti-tip wheels. A standard part of our chair. Yes?
I was just wondering if there was an option to have an add-on. So I was just wondering if there's an option to have an add-on so that you can transform a wheelchair into a bicycle.
Yes, and we've tried a lot, and others on the market in the U.S. and in Europe have tried it, and in Nicaragua. In Nicaragua, 25 years ago, a number of shops were experimenting with that. One made a number of tricycle add-ons that you could clip onto the front of your chair. They would raise your front wheels just 50 millimeters off the ground, and you could pedal and steer.
If you remember from the assistive technology fair, the folks from Roto Mobility had a clip-on lever drive powered that would work with manual chairs, and it was really nice.
So they made a number of different types. They settled on one. They made a few, and the mechanics in the shop ended up being pretty much the only ones who kept using them every day. And they liked them so much that they sawed off their front casters and threw them away. Everything is a trade-off, and the trade-offs of having it removable were greater than the costs of not being able to remove it. At least it was on the small side of tricycles. They had typically a 20-inch front wheel, and it was a little package. My first snap-on front end I made in 1968, and it was a lever drive like this one with a variable height crank and a freewheel connection with bike chain to the front wheel, so I could raise the connection up and down and shift gears. And it worked very nicely, but I parked it outside of the library at Oberlin College, made a quick trip in, used the elevator it was an old Carnegie library with a little elevator, just the right size for a smallish wheelchair, to go up in the stacks. Got my book, came back down, came out, gone. And that happened in Nicaragua as well, because it's good wheelchair, it's good bicycle parts that it's made out of. So so back to the fork. If this chair has 3 degrees, if the bathroom door is just as wide as the hand rims at the axle height, then you can start into the door with a little pressure. And it turns out that 3 degrees is about the flexibility of these spoked wheels and a little flex from the frame that you can just jam your way through there. And the chair goes like this, then it goes like this as you go through the door. The only loser is the poor person who has to paint the door frame afterwards. But there's justice. So that's what we do. And that 3 degrees gives us just enough space for a skinny fork, a specially designed fork, to come around to the axle. We may be able to make a chair using regular bicycle wheels at much lower cost without widening the chair at all. It'll be a little heavier, but maybe only, say, 1 kilogram heavier, 2 pounds heavier, more or less. Anyway, so that's what he's experimenting with. Up there's a meeting of the tricycle riders and wheelchair riders and builders of both. All the tricycle riders build their own pretty much in Nicaragua. Just hashing out what are all the options. Okay, here's a happy sight. This is a fellow riding a 25-year-old Nicaraguan wheelchair, one of our early ones. A little longer wheelbase than usual, 12 degrees tilt in space seat. Center of gravity a little further back than usual, so much more stable, but not as stable as today. Still, he's managed to keep it running, and he's on those cobblestones every single day. Probably covers about between 5 and 10 kilometers every day on cobblestone. Some of the cobblestones much rougher than these. Here's a quadriplegic fellow in Nicaragua who, while I was there, I mounted our newer kinds of brakes. If you look at my brakes, they have a loop on them. This is because some people in the manufacturers are insisting on a brake that looks commercial, and so they mold this rubber handle on it, and it works fine for me. I mean, this is a good brake design, my favorite, in that it doesn't take much force to give it lots of braking power. It's good for if you're working a saw in a vise. Your chair doesn't go back and forth. But this fellow has never had a brake ever in his 40 years of riding since the 1970s. He's never had a chair that he could work the brakes on. Quadriplegic. Just barely can push his own on a flat floor like this. But here you can see on this one, it had a bent rod, 8mm rod handle, and he could drape his finger through there, and his finger would hook, then he could actuate the brake. It takes a little enough force so that his finger didn't fall off as a result. There he is. Yep. Again, one of Nicaragua's leading activists for a long, long time. Yep. Design trade-offs. Who should make them? These folks, the ones who ride them every day. And if I was ever to do a design choice without input, my likelihood of meeting all their needs is very low. So, thank you. Here's a design challenge for all of you. In 1977, I built a chair with 2 of these as my front wheels. It was the first time I found a way to make a chair that would allow me to have a long wheelbase and a short chair, because this rolls sideways on whatever rollers are on the ground, forward and backward, sideways on the rollers, meant that I could put one on each side, put my feet right between the front wheels, and have a nice long wheelbase in a nice short chair. And This is called the Ezekiel wheel. If you read Ezekiel 10:10 in the Old Testament of the Bible, you'll be reading, according to some NASA scientists who did a little translating, twisting, you'll be reading a news account of a spacecraft that landed 3,500 years ago that was in this form, with 4 rollers, not 3. 4 is the minimum you can actually make. And it was a wheel with 4 faces, and each face had 4 eyes. So this works nicely on wheelchairs, works nicely on a number of other things like the omnidirectional assembly platforms that Volvo pushes their cars around in their factory on as they put them together. And it also allowed me to have full 4-wheel drive, because I just put a bike chain between the front and the rear wheels with the right ratio, and I could go backwards up a very high curb, backwards through snow. These pushed better than the rear wheels. It was fine. I rode it for 7 years. Eventually the bearings froze up from riding in too many oceans, too much salt in the bearings. And I've never rebuilt it since. But if anybody has ideas or wants to dig into making this actually work, be light enough, cheap enough, not require 20 ball bearings for a pair of front wheels, etc. Here it is. There are some patents 10 years ago that will guide you on optimizing this, that were done by people who make wheels. They're used by people who make wheels commercially for the platforms that they pull up to the size of a 747 airliner, and one person can push a huge crate of goods in any direction on maybe 300 of these that make up the platforms, but sticking like this.
We did a powered wheelchair using 3 of those at the VA.
In 1980, 84 maybe.
Yeah, it's about sounds about right.
Yeah, Bill Law.
Yep. Yeah, he had the original design.
And patented it.
Yeah. And you see little robots that use this design as well.
Yep. Put 3 of these in a triangle and have some computer tell which one to go which direction. You can change directions and go in any direction at all. You can also do that with a 4-wheel drive patent from a Swedish guy a few years later.
Oh, yeah, that's that guy.
Yep.
That's that.
Bengt Elan.
Yes, I remember that. And the wheelchair also uses these aesthetic capture wheels in front. So.
Yep, the wheel, W-H-I-L-L. It's a Japanese group, one member of which I started working with in 1981. Now he's retired, and he's got a bunch of youngsters working really hard on optimizing these. And they might make something good enough that you could put on a power chair, but still way on the heavy side for a manual chair, and way on the expensive side for 80% of the world.
Okay, let's thank Ralph again. And check it out. It's, I'm sure Ralph can talk about any part of his wheelchair in detail. Thanks for coming. Have a great weekend, and see you on Tuesday for the presentation.